In Arduino, we are given two functions to write, setup and loop, and these get called automatically in the background. But there are times when you may want to write your own functions. In fact, writing your own functions can be extremely useful for when you want to call a section of code multiple times, or you want to divide up your code into more manageable chunks. But let's start by writing our own function. Often, it's easier to think about how you might call your function from your code before you define it. Let's define an integer I and set it to 0. In loop, we'll write I++ to increment it. Now, we have a number that just counts up forever, at least until we reach the maximum value for an int. We want to create a function that determines if I is even or odd, and we'll use it to print even or odd to the serial monitor. So, start by initializing the serial connection in setup. We'll say that we want to store the answer to the is it even question by letting even be 1 and odd be 0. That means we'll need another integer variable. We'll call it e. We don't need to initialize it to any value since the first time we use the variable, we'll set it to something, 1 or 0. Let's pretend that we have already written our function. Figuring out how we want to use it will help us write the function later. So, before we increment I, let's call our function, which we'll name isEven. It's important to note that functions can have a return value. This is some number or character that is handed off from the function when it finishes running. It's like a relay race where one runner hands off a baton to the next runner. This means that we can store the function's return value in a variable. Let's store it in e. So we have e equals isEven, open parentheses, close parentheses, semicolon. Once isEven finishes running, it will return 0 or 1, which is then stored in e. Note that our function isEven will run only once when it is called on this line. So the code is inEven will run once, then I will increment, then isEven will run again, I will increment, and so on. Because I is a global variable, we could just check I in our isEven function, but let's learn how parameters work. A parameter is a variable that we can use to pass data to our function. They act as input, and we call the actual data we pass an argument, or arguments if there is more than one. We need to tell our function which number we want to perform the even or odd check on. We do that by putting the data between the parentheses of our function. So now we have e equals isEven, open parentheses, I, close parentheses, semicolon. Let's finish writing the code that prints even or odd. We'll first print the number so we can check it. Serial.print, open parentheses, I, close parentheses, semicolon. Then, to separate it from the even or odd text, write serial.print, open parentheses, open quotes, colon, space, close quotation marks, close parentheses, semicolon. Because we know that e will be 1 for even and 0 for odd, we can write if e equals 1, open curly brace, serial.println, even, close curly brace, else, open curly brace, serial.println, the string odd. And Arduino should have added the last curly brace for you. After I++, let's add a delay 500 so that we have a chance to see the text flying by. Now, we should have an idea of how to write our function. We define functions outside of other functions, so we'll start writing after the loop function. We know that we want to return an integer, 0 or 1, so we start by writing int. This is the return type. Note that functions in C can only return one value, not more. Any of the data types we discussed previously can be a return type, int, float, char, and so on. You can also use void here, like you see in setup and loop, to state that there is no return value. We need to return an integer, so we'll keep int. Then write the function name, isEven, in this case followed by an open and close parentheses. Inside the parentheses, we need to declare our parameter. The data type of the parameter needs to match the data type of the argument being passed in. Since we're using integers, we'll declare the parameter as an int. We then need to give the parameter a name. We'll use a. It doesn't have to match anything we've used before, and in fact, I highly recommend not using the same name as a global variable like I or E in this case to avoid confusion. If you need more than one parameter, you separate them by commas. For example, we could have int a, comma, char c, comma, float f, comma, and so on. Note that if you ask for 3 parameters, 3 arguments must be given every time you call the function. So in our isEven call, we'd have to provide a character and float in addition to the integer, all separated by commas. Since we don't need those, just delete them. Leave our input integer though. Now, type an open curly brace after our function definition name and hit enter. What we write in between the curly braces, another code block, will be executed every time isEven is called. To determine if our number is even, we'll use an if statement. Note that we're using a now, as that's what we called our parameter. The value of a will be what was passed into our function. If we look at our call to isEven, we see that value comes from whatever is in I each time isEven is called. To determine if our number is even, we need to know if it is divisible by 2. We can't quite use the divide operator for that, but we can use modulo. Write if, open parentheses, a modulo 2 equals 0, close parentheses, open curly brace. Return 1, semicolon. If the remainder of our number after being divided by 2 is 0, that means it is divisible by 2 and therefore even, so we return 1. Even though this program might run, we're still missing an important step. If you say that a function returns a value, you should always make sure something gets returned. If a is odd in our function, the return statement is never called. We need to add a return case for when a is odd. So write else open curly brace, return 0, semicolon. Now our function returns 1 if the argument is even and 0 if it's odd. Upload and open the serial monitor. You should see each number printed followed by whether that number is even or odd. Keep in mind that functions don't have to have return values or parameters. Without a return value, you should set the return type to void. Let's write a function called sayHi. Beneath our isEven function, write void sayHi, open parentheses, close parentheses, open curly brace. Serial.println hi. And Arduino should have closed the code block for us with a curly brace. Notice that we didn't have to call return because we specify no return value type. Up in setup, after serial.begin, call our function sayHi. Run it, and you should see hi appear before our list of numbers. If it helps you remember how to write a function, here is a template. You should always specify the return type for the function even if it is void. Then, name your function followed by parentheses. Note that function names follow similar rules as naming variables. You can only use letters, numbers, and underscores, no spaces. You define the parameters inside the parentheses after the function name. Between the curly braces is where you write the body of the function, what code runs whenever the function is called. Finally, if you defined a return type that's not void, you should return a value. As your programs get longer, writing functions can help you keep everything neat and orderly. You also should not be afraid to write a function if you find yourself writing the same few lines of code over and over again.